Hey Screenwriters. Today we're going to talk about intellectual property, or IP, and Hollywood's current obsession with it, and how it's going to impact your screenwriting career and what you can do about it. So let's get into it. So if you're any way connected with the industry, you've heard the term IP before, and you're probably familiar with Hollywood's current obsession with IP. So what is IP and how does it affect you? Well, technically, IP is anything that you create with your own intellectual capacity. So it can be short stories or novels or your screenplays or your pitch decks or anything that you create with your own creativity. That's technically IP. So as a screenwriter, technically you probably have a lot of IP lying around if you've written scripts. But for the sake of this video, we're defining IP in a very narrow way. We're defining IP as a story idea or a concept that either already exists in a franchise such as Star Wars or Marvel or Indiana Jones, for example, or exists in a different medium like a novel, a comic book, a video game, even a newspaper article. Hollywood's current obsession with IP is about those things. It's about their obsession with story ideas or concepts that either already exist, again, that they were already been produced in a TV show or in a movie that they want to reboot or remake, or already exists in a different format, such as in a comic book or a novel. Currently, Hollywood seems to have a fixation on IP, and that they only seem to be developing or producing things based on existing IPs. This is why everything seems to be either a remake or a reboot or a sequel nowadays. It seems that you can't watch anything unless it has already existed in a different format in a different way before, or it already existed and it's just a sequel of something. Now, technically, sequels and remakes are not necessarily a new thing in Hollywood. Sequels have been around forever, and technically, Hollywood's obsession with IP goes back to its founding days as a medium. Some of the earliest movies ever made were made from stories from the Bible or from Shakespeare or from existing literature. So the desire to remake or adapt something that already exists isn't necessarily a new thing. What is a new thing seems to be this hyper focus around exclusively IP-driven content. It's the reason why, for example, Disney is going to spend the next decade making live-action versions of their animated movies. It's the reason why there's going to be remakes and reboots of existing properties, even obscure existing properties, for streaming and for theatrical releases at a level that we haven't seen before. Now, a lot of people have been complaining and arguing that this need to remake or reboot things is a relatively new phenomenon. That's not entirely true. Let's look at a simple example. Recently, Lady Gaga remade a movie called A Star is Born. Well, that movie was originally made in 1934, and then again in 1957, and again in 1976. So remakes are not necessarily a new thing. They've been around Hollywood for a long time. But there is something particularly unique about this era's obsession with IP. There is something almost pathological about Hollywood's obsession with IP in today's world. In the 1990s, it was sort of the golden age of independent filmmaking. And what was independent filmmaking? Independent filmmaking meant screenplays and movies based on original ideas. It meant there was creativity in the marketplace. There were stories that you haven't seen before. Directors such as Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino led the charge in terms of independent cinema in the 1990s. The directors and the writers themselves have become the IP. But that's a rare exception right now. For the most part, Hollywood is still greenlighting and still producing content exclusively driven by IP. Even in television, usually one of the bastions of independent content, one of the bastions of original content, is now being driven by IP. A lot of the TV shows that are being produced are either reboots of all TV shows or they're based on novels or comic books. To give you an idea of what this looks like, there's a wonderful website called Movie Insider. And if you go through it, it shows you all the movies that are currently in development or currently in pre-production or currently being discussed in terms of being made. And the one thing that's very obvious is that the majority of movies coming out over the next 2 or 3 years are almost all IP driven. The level of risk averseness that Hollywood has on new content is at an all-time high. They're simply not taking risks on original stories any longer. And while they're still optioning spec scripts, they're still buying spec scripts, they're not producing spec scripts. And for screenwriters such as us that produce original content, this can be a major hindrance in terms of us getting into the industry. So what can we do about it? So as a screenwriter, how does this affect us? Well, if you're like me, you're probably writing original content. You probably can't afford to license a newspaper article or a novel or a comic book. You're relying on your own creativity and your own ideas for your stories. Well, Hollywood's current IP obsession puts a hindrance on our ability to break into the industry, because if they're looking for IP-driven content, if they're looking to adapt things that already exist in a different medium, what can we do about it? Well, there is some good news throughout all of this, and there are some things that you can do to help push your career forward. The first thing is to identify genres that seem to be independent of the sort of IP hysteria. There are two genres right now that consistently produce original content independent of intellectual property. That's thrillers and that's horror. So if you want to write a screenplay, an original screenplay, independent of IP, writing a thriller or writing a horror seems to be your best bet to getting it produced. Those two genres still produce independent content at a much higher rate than other genres. So if you want to break into the industry, consider writing a thriller, consider writing a horror. The next thing you can do is to see if you can take an IP that exists in the public domain and adapting that. So there's a lot of books and a lot of novels, a lot of characters that exist in what's called the public domain, in a sphere of law that allows for you to borrow and steal and rewrite and readapt characters without having to pay a licensing fee, because the stories are much older and pre-exist copyright law. So things like Shakespeare, things like Greek mythology, things like the Bible, things like the works of Mary Shelley or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, characters like Sherlock Holmes or Zorro, all exist in the public domain. You can take those characters and do whatever you want with them. So if you want to create something and still satisfy Hollywood's obsession with IP development, you should consider taking a character that's in the public domain, that is familiar to people, and telling a different story with it, adapting that story, making it fresher, making it new, bringing it into the 21st century. That's a great way to both satisfy Hollywood's need for IP as well as satisfy your ability to create something new. Does this all mean you shouldn't write your dream spec script? Not entirely. Spec scripts are still a phenomenal way to showcase your voice, to showcase your talent, to showcase to agents, to managers, to directors, to producers, how you think and how you bring a world to life. There's no better way of showing your unique voice than via a spec script. But if you want to get that spec script produced, you're probably going to have to attach a known director or a known actor to it. To be honest with you, there is no worse time to have an original idea in Hollywood than right now. But that doesn't mean that you should stop writing, and that doesn't mean you should stop being ambitious. There are a few things you can actually do to game the system. One of the things you can do is to take your screenplay and adapt it into a novel first. So take the existing screenplay that you have and turn it into a short story, or turn it into a book, even a comic book. Have that story exist in a different format first before you send your screenplay out to Hollywood. That way, when they ask, is this based on an original IP, you can say, actually it is. There's a comic book out there right now, or there's a novel out there right now that exists before the screenplay exists. So you satisfy their urge for IP, you still control your intellectual property by developing it in a different format, so that when you go and showcase your screenplay, you can argue that it already exists in the world, to satisfy that craving that Hollywood has right now to adapting established IP. There are a lot of screenwriters that have done this and continue to do this. In particular, a lot of them are developing graphic novels or comic books based on their screenplays, just given what the appetite in Hollywood is right now for comic books or graphic novel adaptations. It's a very difficult time right now to be a screenwriter in Hollywood, especially if you don't have established IPs. But don't let that stop you from writing, and don't let that stop you from dreaming. Go out there, showcase your voice, and write your screenplays. Sooner or later, Hollywood's obsession with IP is going to come to an end, and they're going to be craving for original content. So keep writing. When they're ready for original content, you want to make sure you have as much of it ready to go as possible. So that's it. That's my video for this week. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, drop them in the box below.